Hi there. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for being here for another Theory of Change episode. We've got a great program as always and a great guest. But before we get into that, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So I did want everybody to remind everyone that this show is part of the Flux Media Network, and the website address is flux.community. You can go there to find more articles and podcasts about politics, technology, media, and society, and how they all interrelate with each other. And so I do encourage everybody to do that. And then if you want, you can also go directly to the Theory of Change section on Flux. Just go to theoryofchange.show, and you will go to the archives there, and we've got videos and audio and also transcripts for people who want to read those as well of all the episodes. But you do have to be a member of our Patreon if you want to get the full transcript of all the episodes. So you can go to patreon.com/discoverflux to get those. And needless to say, we don't have any giant corporate billionaires or academic institutions backing this show, so we can definitely use your support in that regard to keep doing these. So appreciate that, and those who do contribute, your contributions are definitely appreciated. All right, so let's get into today's program. The future is a funny thing. It's always around the corner, and yet it never quite arrives. And that's certainly true when speaking about the technology industry. As the personal computer revolution and the internet began spreading around the world in the 1980s and 90s, commentators and entrepreneurs made fortunes telling everyone that we were going to have a technological utopia in which everything was possible. It was parallel to what was happening in the political world, where the collapse of the Soviet Union inspired writers and politicians to declare that humanity had reached the end of history, a singular moment in time in which we could have the freedom of social democracy, as smiling and benevolent billionaires provided everything we could ever want at unimaginably low prices. In the years since, however, all of these promises have failed to materialize. Well, most of them. Well, we can indeed get more stuff than ever before. Wages have been stagnant, millions have abandoned the labor force, and political extremism is a threat like never before, even as the supposedly benevolent billionaires have begun to increasingly ally themselves with religious fundamentalists in the hopes of preserving the massive wealth they've extracted from the world economy. One person who saw this coming is Richard Barbrook, our guest today on this episode. He's the co-author of a 1995 essay called The Californian Ideology, which was a rare contemporary dissent from what later became known as neoliberalism, and also the emerging techno-libertarianism as well. Years later, he wrote a 2007 re-examination of these issues for a book that was called Imaginary Futures, From Thinking Machines to the Global Village. Welcome to Theory of Change, Richard.
Thank you. Welcome from snowy London to warm California.
Yeah, well, there's no evidence of either location right now.
It's a bit dark outside, but my patio is covered with snow. You'll be glad to hear.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's definitely not something that happens here in Southern California. But speaking of that, though, of course, our conversation today, so we're going to kind of structure it in parts here. So we're certainly going to talk about the Californian ideology that you co-wrote in 1995. But I do want to maybe go into the history of where all this, the tech world came from, because there's some misconceptions about how everything got started with the internet and things like that. So why don't you take us back before all of that Silicon Valley stuff got started, if you could, please.
I wrote the Imaginary Futures because I was always very skeptical about the origin myth of the internet, because they would say, well, it was invented because in a nuclear war, they didn't want to have a centralized telecommunication system. So they were going to replace, cheap, reliable switches with expensive, flaky mainframes. So there was obviously something weird going on there this what Paul Barron's original report for RAND was about. And then this whole thing about where it was then taken up by the hippie generation in the 60s. And these were the people who actually created Silicon Valley, the internet, and the digital revolution, which was proclaimed to be transforming the whole planet and transforming it into California. And so I sort of went backwards to see what was going on. And as I was doing this, I came across these references around this particular years, 1964, 1965, which was actually when I, as a child, was actually in America. I went to a junior school in Boston, Massachusetts. And because my father was on a CIA scholarship to spend a year at MIT Political Science Department, where every professor and every graduate student was funded by the CIA at that point. And so I had that experience through my parents of actually being part of that sort of, the extension of the empire into Europe. And we went to the New York World's Fair. On the way, we actually went by boat. We must be one of the last generations who actually traveled to America by boat. We got off at New York and there was this World's Fair on. So we went to it. And I was curious. The picture that's on the front, the photo, was taken by my father of us with the Unisphere behind us. And also, yes, and also the bit I don't like is there's this pagoda at the back, and it's Taiwan pretending it's China. So this is what I was curious about how that particular the vision of the high-tech future that was being produced then inspired actually the technologies that we later create the internet. And it's to do with the Cold War race between America and the Soviet Union, the two empires, basically.
Well, and as you noted, that the American response, the Americans were responding to some ideas that the Soviets
they had in. It was a sense that this Russian comrade pointed out to me. They were the last generation who really believed the Soviet Union was about to build communism. And so in the late 1950s, 1960s, there was a group of reformers who thought, well, the problem with Stalinism is it's basically the industrial stage of modernity. And if we bring in computers and networking, we can create what they call cybernetic communism. And Khrushchev at the 22nd Communist Party of the Soviet Union Congress actually said, we will be in cybernetic communism by the 1970s. And
what was that supposed to mean, cybernetic communism?
It's a bit like, the people nowadays say, well, it's what Walmart does or any large corporation. It's using computer networks to plan the economy. So there was, you have this central planning. The problem is, what Miso points out is how do you get the information? How do you respond to changes in the economy? I mean, I have friends who grew up in the old Soviet bloc, and they would say, well, at one point everybody wants to have white flared jeans because ABBA is the music they're all liking, or hippiedom in general, and then suddenly the system responds to it, but by the time it's responded and produced white flared jeans, punk has arrived and they all want black skinny jeans instead. It just doesn't have, and that's a sort of very trivial example, but it's a general problem of the system. So they thought you could solve that by having real-time planning. If somebody goes into a shop and buys black straight skinny jeans instead of white flared jeans, it would immediately go back to the jean factory and tell them to switch from one to the other. And in a sense, you can see that there's a lot of the just-in-time production systems today have sort of realised that. The difficulty is, I know, again, people who lived there at the time, it's a friend of mine whose father was involved in Poland in these ideas, is they didn't have the telephone systems or the computers. They had the idea, though. And I think the idea terrified certain people in America because, we had the bomber gap and the missile gap, and then they thought there was going to be a cybernetics gap. And that's what's really interesting. Why did they spend all this money on building the internet, this flaky communication system. And I think I realized that a lot of people say, well, they had this technology and then they built fantasies like the Californian ideology on top of the technology. But what's interesting is the fantasies in a sense have to come first to get the funding, both in the Soviet Union and in America. And the key one was who owns the future, because in the Cold War, the Soviet Union says, well, we're behind, we're not as democratic, we're not as rich as America, but we are the beta version of the communist future. And in America, it's very difficult because in a way, what comes after the consumer society? Because you can't have, for historical reasons, Americans couldn't say, well, we're going to build communism, right? Yeah. So they have to have another vision of the future. And that's where all these ideas like the information society, network society, technotronic society, all these ideas, they're sort of the American substitute for Soviet communism.
Yeah.
The next stage in history. Yeah.
Yeah. And in I guess in a lot of ways there was kind of presaged with the idea of the space race as well. Got that started, and we kept seeing this dynamic of rivalry between capitalism and communism, repeating in different spheres.
Really, they never claimed to be communist. That's the point. I think that's the other point, which was obscured by the whole collapse of the Soviet Union, is that the people adopted this American Cold War that somehow the Soviet Union was communist, when they never claimed to be communist. They said we are really existing socialists. It was like in China, they socialism with Chinese character. Communism was the future that they're building. That's the point. I think you have this, again, we forget this because we're living in the 2020s, or even when we were writing California in the 1990s, people had already forgotten that trajectory of history. As you said in the opening, that Francis Fukuyama takes the Hegelian idea. It was actually a Hegelian Marxist idea coming from Alexander Kojève, that of the concept of the end of history. And he takes that and basically appropriates it for what at the time was neoconservatism in America. And says we are the next stage of history. Everywhere else, we're like the beta version of the future, and everyone else will become like us.
Well, and it was also the idea that nothing else can exist, except for what we were talking about.
Because America had won the Cold War. In some sense. So, of course, in another sense, America had lost the Cold War and has been looking for it ever since. Yeah.
Well, so all right. Well, so that takes us to that's sort of the historical background on
well, I think the key thing is to think about why they spent so much money developing the internet. It's not an obvious thing to develop compared to, other military technologies or civilian technology. And also, why did they fixate on that particular technology as the one that was going to create a new society? I mean, if you think about, jumbo jets, the shipping container, antibiotic. I mean, there's a whole series of other technology that probably had in many ways, a more profound effect on modern societies. But they didn't. They fetishize almost this particular, what used to be called the convergence of computing, telecommunications, and media into one. And that is interesting. That particular part of the economy. I mean, again, as we know today, if we look at Wall Street, these corporations are very powerful and large. But why pick on that particular technology as the one that creates the next stage in history?
Yeah. Well, that's
an interesting thing in itself, because what they're saying is that human history. I mean, this is what Marshall McLuhan provided for. He was at the American side.
For people who don't know who Marshall McLuhan was,
Marshall McLuhan was a Canadian English professor who created a form of media technological determinism. I'm very simplifying his theory. I think it's not so much what he wrote as what it became, what the French called McLuhanism. I think you have to distinguish between the two. But what he says is that, essentially most of human history we had the oral stage, pre-literate, and then you have printing, and printing creates all those things which we associate with capitalism, nationalism, individualism, and all the rest of it. And then we'll go in the 1960s, we are creating the internet, essentially, the tribal drum, you know, the global, which he then calls the global village, which is a phrase people still use today. And that's going to create the next stage of human history. This, when, you know, he's talking about, you know, Telstar satellites and color television, but, you know, because he's been told by the CIA, among other people, about cybernetic, the whole prediction of cybernetic communism, he then, in a sense, domesticates it for the American audience and becomes very famous in the process.
Yeah. Well,
and it's taken up by, you know, Daniel Bell and Zbigniew Brzezinski and a whole range of people ever since have basically been doing the same prediction again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, and there was, you know, and that's a good point there, because, you know, the technological determinism, it was a political project initially, and it became, you know, like, I mean, it's kind of difficult, I think, in the United States for Americans. You know, the term neoliberalism, it doesn't mean the same thing to your average American, of course, because we have this strange definition of liberal here.
You're stuck in the late 19th century, don't you? You didn't make the evolution. Most of other, you know, capitalist countries, the liberals collapsed into the conservatives. And then you have the emergence of a socialist, social democratic communist party, some of which are indistinguishable from liberal parties anyway, but the rhetoric changes, basically.
Yeah. So just to go back to right before your paper, The Californian Ideology, which came out in 1995. So at that time in the 80s and the 90s, you know, there was an emergence of these sort of right-wing voices like Newt Gingrich, like George Gilder, who were, you know, both very fundamentalist Christian far-right individuals, but they had read their McLuhan and they had absorbed it. And they were some of the earliest backers of some of this type of thinking.
In Europe, it was slightly different because we sort of lost our religion, you know, somewhere along the way.
Certainly in UK, especially.
Yeah. They would say God died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But so here it was there were people around the Margaret Thatcher's government from 1979 to 1990 who definitely connected together new technologies, the sunrise industries, as they used to call them, and neoliberal economics, which obviously she was one of the champions of. So we had a slightly different version of it in Europe, and particularly in the 1980s when Francois Mitterrand, who was elected in the early 80s as president of France as a socialist, and when his attempts to reflate the economy through nationalisation plan failed, they then shifted to a sort of soft form of neoliberalism and a fascination with Silicon Valley. So, but again, it didn't import, as you say, all that Newt Gingrich, the sort of implicit racism, the love of the Confederacy, and all these other bizarre things that it was associated with it in America.
Yeah, and then of course there were the Ayn Rand,
who's never been popular in Europe. I mean, she's a terrible novelist and a horrible human being. So she's never really had a constituency here at all. I mean, there's probably a few people who on the right who, because they've been to America, are into Ayn Rand, but I don't think she's really had the influence. I mean, the person who was the big influence here in the 1980s was Friedrich von Hayek, because Margaret Thatcher said The Road to Serfdom was her favourite book, and The Constitution of Liberty probably was her second favourite book. So, and that says, if you have a welfare state, the next stage is the Gulag Archipelago, basically. So it's real. I remember reading it after she got out. I just thought, this is batshit crazy, this book, but it's incredibly influential.
Well, and one of the things that I think is sort of unnoticed or not remarked on enough about this ideology is that it's deliberately anti-factual, it's anti-empirical, with this idea of
but the whole
you can see it. Well, I'm sorry, you can see it with the later evolution of that with von Mises, with this idea of praxeology, which was like this bastardized, weird Marxist
I think you have, you have to understand that neoliberal economics is a subset of neoclassical economics, which is crazy, basically. I mean, I was taught it at what you would call high school, and I remember Trevor Jones on my first day of economics did the sort of demand and supply curve on the board and said to us, "This is all wrong, but you have to learn it to pass the exam." And it was only many years later when I read Adam Smith and Karl Marx and people like that I realised that marginal utility theory is, when you actually seriously think about the marginalist theory of price, it's obviously nuts, basically. It doesn't make any sense in reality, but it serves its purpose, because what they're trying to do is to avoid any form of the labour theory of value, which is what, Adam Smith says, well, what does a market do? It divides and distributes labour. That's what a factory, he compares it to a factory where you divide and distribute. And they say, that's, whatever else, whatever you can argue about the price, the way it actually operates and manifests itself. But on the most basic level, that he doesn't see that it's an economy of labour and nature is really interesting. That they actually had to, in the late 19th century, obviously they found that the appropriation of Adam Smith and David Ricardo became really politically embarrassing, because people said, well, your profit is basically stolen from us. I mean, that's a rather crude way of thinking about it, but nonetheless, it has a certain element of truth in it. And so they had to invent another theory that denied that somehow there was an equal exchange going on between the employer and the worker. And then therefore the whole theoretical edifice of the sorts of economics you're taught at school and at universities, and they have lots of journals and hardly paper, is at its absolute core, it's sort of like creationism or Ptolemaic astrology or something, and that's the difficult. So neoliberalism has that problem, that it doesn't even have the practical accommodations to reality that Keynes had to do and his followers.
Well, and I guess we could probably talk further on that, but I did so we're now at the point then where the American government has invested all this money in computer networking and physically laying down wires, and actually they started on what later became Wi-Fi actually in the 1960s, and the idea of forcing AT&T to give away the code of Unix, not being allowed to sell it. I mean, so there were all these host of things that were completely anti-capitalistic.
Whereas in the Soviet Union, simultaneously, they got very frightened by this vision of cybernetic communism. But I have a friend who grew up in the Soviet Union, and he said all the computer networks were deliberately made so they were incompatible. They couldn't be linked together because they didn't want people linked. The one thing they didn't want was feedback. The bureaucracy didn't want feedback from the workers and peasants about what shitty job they were doing. Well,
and so anyway, but so the U.S. government had invested all this money and behaved decidedly uncapitalistic and created the internet, and ARPANET first, and then later what became the internet, and so that takes us to 1995, and when you were working on the Californian ideology and with your colleague. So tell us, first of all, what is this idea of, what does the Californian ideology mean?
Well, I think you have to go back to that period in England. So we had a long period of conservative government, and there was just like now actually there was an economic downturn, but there was all this ideas coming in from America. So the internet arrives. A friend of mine set up one of the world, actually turned out by accident to be the world's first internet cafe in Soho in London. And in this cafe, you'd meet people who would be, against, privatizing healthcare or railways or things like that. But as soon as it got on to talking about computers or the internet, they would suddenly start spouting neoliberal ideology. So, and this was because they were all reading this magazine called Wired. And so me and Andy Cameron were setting up an MA in hypermedia studies for the University of Westminster. And we sort of wrote the California ideology partly as a manifesto to attract students, to say, well, we think differently about this than the sort of stuff they're talking about in Wired. And it was, as I say, partly we wrote it for ourselves and for this mailing list, this sort of European mailing list called Net Time. And it just took off. It was just, we were really surprised. I mean, it was published by a Mute magazine in London, and then we distributed it on this Net Time mailing list, and suddenly it went off like a rocket, and it was like viral. It went viral, I guess we now say. And what I always remember reading an article somewhere where they just talked about the California ideology, and they didn't link to our article. And initially I thought, oh, that's bad. Why aren't they credited? And then I thought, actually, no, that shows you're a success. When you invented a phrase and it's passed into everyday language, and people don't need to be told where it comes from, that's success, basically. Yeah, and it's still going. I mean, that's the other thing, is that here we are talking about it, decades later, and so it's obviously hit a nerve. It's interesting. I think the Well had this. Bruce Sterling hosted this group in there called Loony Lefties Sniping at Wired or something, and it was all and Louis Rossetto was deeply annoyed with it and all the rest of it. That was good. We managed to hit.
Well, you're going to have to say who is
Louis Rossetto was this rather dodgy character who was the editor of Wired. He'd actually lived in Amsterdam. So I don't know what the Dutch did to him. I mean, the Dutch social democracy, you think that would be a sort of ideal thing to imitate in America, get you out of your cars and onto bicycles. But for some reason, he had a real animus, not so much against the Soviet Union, a bit like Hayek and Mises. It's actually social democracy. That's what they really didn't like. And he had the same thing. What he really didn't like was social democracy, even in a sort of mild West European type, and so it obviously really got to him.
Well, okay, so but the title, I guess, tell us about the title. Why did you guys use that?
Well, there's a very famous book called by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called The German Ideology. They usually just publish the edited version because it has a sort of a really simplified and very readable, their vision of the materialist conception of history. They sort of update this theory, which Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson are the great developers of, but they sort of update that for mid 19th century socialists. But there's a lot of the book which is usually not published. I mean, it was never published anyway, but it only came out in the early 20th century when they published this manuscript. Is slagging off their fellow students at the University of Berlin. They're sort of settling accounts with all the people who used to get drunk with in taverns in Berlin. And they just go through them systematically, mocking their beliefs. And what they're arguing in the German ideology is not that all Germans have this ideology, but this particular form of sort of what they call left Hegelianism. It's just a sort of form of radical republicanism, but very philosophically based, could only have happened in Germany at this particular time, and it wouldn't have happened in France or in Britain or America or anywhere else. And we thought this was a good analogy because this sort of mixture of new left and new right, the sort of hippie capitalist, is a very Californian phenomenon, and you wouldn't have got it in Boston, for instance, or New York, or other places where technology was being developed at the time. And so we thought that was a really good analogy to make. I don't think whether many people got where we nicked the title from, I don't know. But of course, and also it had a sort of, it sounds quite poetical, doesn't it? And it's interesting because I say, having gone back to California since then, I've discovered it's now on the reading list for undergraduates. Because if it's enough ago, you eventually become part of the people who criticize California, become part of the Californian theoretical universe, which I suppose is quite flattering in a way.
Well, and I guess one of the things that is striking to me about the essay at the time was that this in the United States in particular, but I think you saw it later with Tony Blair and his third way, quote unquote. is that a lot of the people who embrace this, what you guys call the Californian ideology, which in many ways is just like a shorthand, one could argue, for a form of libertarianism, right?
Or neoliberalism, as we would call
it. Neoliberalism, which these, for people who have an understanding of political ideologies and history, these are traditions which are firmly on the ideological right side.
Oh, yeah.
But for people at that time in the 90s and ever since, like Elon Musk, or like a number of these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, they actually thought that they were on the left, which is really a measure of how, what you were saying, that it was kind of they were taking cultural affects of new left sort of personal liberation, but completely ignoring any of the economic and social aspects of it.
Well, what they ignore is the class politics. That's the great, since the 1848 revolutions, you're only on the left if you actually talk about class politics. I mean, obviously fighting against racism, sexism, heterosexualism is important, but that's to unite the workers against the capitalist class. They're not in themselves the issue. So this sort of radical liberalism about individual identity, how can you have individual freedom without collective freedom? And that's like a mid-19th century concept, which is abandoned, I think, by a lot, by late 20th century in many ways.
Yeah,
and I think that we're still living in the aftermath of that. Actually, it's very difficult to get people to even, it's interesting in America. If you look at people like the Democratic Socialists of America, who I'd be in many ways very sympathetic with, it's interesting how much identity politics obsesses them to the detriment of class politics. So they don't, they don't see it as creating class unity. They see that it is in itself the main struggle. And okay, you can say that's part of the history of America, with, you had slavery for hundreds of years, and then institutionalized discrimination. And you had immigrant society with lots of different nationalities having, creating these, communal politics and sexism and all the rest of it. But there's something very distinctive about that. And, again, it's interesting how people like Daniel Bell, who is, the coming of the post-industrial society, one of these predictors of the California, forerunners of the California ideology. He also wrote The End of Ideology, where he says class politics is over and what we're going to have is competing interest groups. That is the future. And that's, he's the CIA promoted theorist. And so it's interesting that sort of liberalism, in that sense of the word, social liberalism, connects with neoliberalism together. And it's that funny thing, if you watch Fox News, they all talk about the left or the socialists, and you realize actually they're talking about people who are very right wing.
Yeah, well, and then they also will say that the left is the real racist, the left is the real sexist or whatever, and like it is like an attempt to cloak their reactionary politics.
But I think
sort of vaguely left-wing.
The Democrats are doing exactly the same. I don't think there's, in that sense, if you look at it from the outside, there's one thing the California ideology is they're just two bits of the war. The Catholic, they're two bits of the war party. They're all funded by the military-industrial complex. They all love wars. They go around invading other people's countries. And then internally, Joe Biden has just broken your railroad unions strike, and he's supposed to be on the left. And you've got all those people like AOC and the Squad. They've all voted for the imperialist war in Ukraine, and they've all voted to break a strike, and so they are the left. But that's really weird. There's nothing left about either of those positions.
Yeah. Well, and so but the contentions, though, of the essay basically were that,
it's a different time when at least, the rhetoric, it's interesting because now in America, basically since Bernie Sanders run is at least there's a rhetoric of socialism and even communism now, whereas then there wasn't at all. As you're right, at that point, it appeared the radicals were entrepreneurs. They were the revolutionaries, the people creating new technologies, Well, later I wrote this book called The Class of the New. You know, how there's a group of people who are, you know, creating new things in new ways with new technologies, and that's what they seem to be. They seem to be a beta version of the future, and we'd all copy them.
Yeah, and that was how a lot of American political reporters would write about California.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, actually, that was true in some sense. That, you know, especially let's say like with regard to same-sex marriage becoming a controversy. Things like that. So, and as being the most populous state, you know, obviously there would be something like that.
Legalizing weed, all those different culture wars.
Well, so okay, so and basically the point of the essay was to say that, look, this, you know, it's presenting itself as something new and completely different, but it's actually really not that different. It's just using technological trappings, if you will, right?
It's promoting this. You know, you have to understand that was like the apogee of the American empire's unipolar moment, wasn't it? The obvious opposition, which was, you know, Stalinism in Russia in its various forms and interpretations, had failed. Yeah, it collapsed into. I mean, that was the 1990s. It was a period of absolute disaster in Russia. And then the other obvious contender, which is China, was then keeping its head down and taking the capitalist road. You know, so that seemed to be going. I mean, the prediction was, okay, Tiananmen Square had been defeated, but that China would evolve into America. Yeah. And so then, you know, if you read, I mean, even if you read, you know, Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, and that's only what 10, 15 years ago. It's not that long ago. You know, he's convinced that India, for instance, is a contender against China. You know, and this sort of thing. And he's convinced that, you know, that India's great advantage is they speak English and they're more like America. You know, and all those are the tropes that the Chinese can't innovate; they're just imitators, you know, etc., etc. You know, that it's somehow this totalitarian society, and so it's interesting that you know, even now, if you look at that book now, for instance, because that's a good example of the sort of New York Times version of the Californian ideology, is how dated it seems. You know, that confidence that the whole world will become America. And I think there's partly, you know, you can see why, because if you go to America, there's lots of people who come from different cultures and become American. And so the assumption is the whole world wants to do that. The idea that people actually have their own history, their own cultures, and their own trajectory to modernity. I mean, again, I have, you know, if you talk to Chinese comrades, they always think this is hilarious, the idea that they're going to somehow abandon the whole history of, you know, the Long March and the 1949 revolution and Mao, all the experience of Mao and everything that's happened since. You think, oh yeah, at some point they will become some, you know, well, lots of Chinese actually I know who think, well, I taught Chinese students who all said that we are a democracy. Actually, they looked round at all the Westerners in this seminar group and said, China is a democracy. Our living standards go up every year. And then the implicit being to with all the other people, and yours don't. Things get better every year in China. The government responds to what we want. You know, it's a bit difficult to counter that. So they have a different trajectory of history. And that's something now, I know Chinese people can feel very self-confident about saying in public in a way they wouldn't have done in the 1990s.
Yeah. Well, and it was and we should get into that a little bit later. But so what was the reaction to the essay after it came out?
Well, so I think.
I mean, did anybody get? I guess I'm sorry.
There was outrage.
Did anyone get upset at it?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, there was outrage among the Wired crew. Louis Rosetto was, I gather, absolutely furious with it. I was told that Howard Rheingold. When I was at this event with Howard Rheingold, who's one of this very sweet old hippie who wrote The Virtual Community and Smart Mobs, I think it's called. Very nice guy, but I was told beforehand he was slightly worried about meeting me because he thought I was some sort of hardline communist who'd beat him up or something, which I thought was quite funny. We got on all right when we met. And then, of course, the other reaction, though, in Europe was to see it as an anti-American piece, which we also found in a way more disturbing, that it was seen as a sort of anti-American manifesto, because it's not in a way. It's because, you know, I've lived in America. One of the great loves of my life is America. You know, so I'm not anti-American. You know, it's the system I don't like. You know, I don't like the government, and you know, that's the reason I wouldn't live there. But I'm not anti-American, and there is this sort of, unfortunately, because it's an empire and it's done horrible things to people all over the world, you get this sort of knee-jerk anti-Americanism. So it's not that we thought in some ways is a rather disturbing side of the reaction, because in a way, you know, a lot of stuff about the new left is very positive. As you said, you know, we all grew up on that sort of hippie culture, even if I became a punk and said never trust a hippie. But we're all influenced by those the music and the culture, the drugs, you know, all the rest of it. We all absorbed that as part. You know, we all read the Electric Kool-Aid acid test and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and that became part of our view of the world. You know, that was the weird thing about the empire. You know, in lots of parts of it, I don't think now really so much, but in the past, the major opposition to the empire actually came from inside America.
Yeah.
So it's not an anti-American piece, and it's certainly not an anti-Californian piece.
Well, it's. I mean, definitely mostly analytic. I would say.
And so you know, I think it's interesting. I mean, we didn't really say this in the piece, but you know, in many ways, Wired was copying from Mondo 2000, which was this, you know, which Are You Serious and St. Jude set up, and that was like much more critical of what's going on and slightly anarchic, to put it mildly. So that you know, that wasn't a corporate sponsored magazine, and so in a way, that's what we were looking back to, you know, with nostalgia.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, but I mean, at the same time, though, you raise an interesting point, though, that while Wired, you know, was heavily corporate sponsored and actually inspired a lot of imitators like Inc. or Fast Company, another one. You know,
Salon, which you worked for, was very much in that. But you know, they took the sort of the same way Rolling Stone co-opted the whole counterculture. They took the underground press and they turned it into a commercial product. You know, I mean, here we had the New Musical Express. The NME did the same thing with magazines.
But it is interesting though that do you feel like that nothing to sort of counteract that kind of emerged on the left as a sort of a technologically interested?
There was a magazine that predated Wired called Process Word, and that was really good. I mean, that was sort of very much people in and around Silicon Valley who were using, like, you know, they'd read Marx for a start, which helps. And they were really engaging with a lot of these sort of transformations, the way technology was affecting, you know, how people worked and how people lived. And that's sort of what was lost, I think, in that period. And it was that triumphalism, wasn't it, of the 1990s. I think people forget that now because the empire is in severe crisis. How self-confident it was. You know, this is before the debacles in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and now in Ukraine. You know, so that was a different age where it did appear that, you know, the whole world would become America in a way. You could see that, you know, from, you know, you read like The Long Boom, which the Wired produced. They actually started with a chapter called The American Ideology, right, which I thought was a neat homage to us. And that's what they say. The whole world will become like us. And I don't think anybody could say that now.
Yeah. Well, now one thing that was emerging during that time, it was very, very nascent, was what later came to be called the open source software movement, or free software. If I remember right, I think it was 1989, I think it was, or 91, when Richard Stallman founded the GNU project. You guys didn't mention that. Were you aware of that at that time?
Well, I later wrote a piece called Cyber Communism, which was sort of, you know, partly came out of the writing of Imaginary Futures. I was invited to this 50th anniversary of Marshall McLuhan first talking at Fordham University in New York. This is a Catholic university. And so I got up and made this. It was just before the dot-com bust, so it must have been like 97, 98. And I said, just joking, I said the US military invented the only working model of communism in human history. It's called the internet. And then I wrote an article basically taking that paper and riffing on it about the way that, it's interesting, again, partly because it's obviously coming out of the Cold War, the way you get a lot of the corporate Silicon Valley, as you said, is status. It comes out of the state, essentially state planning even. I think Bob Reich says that America has central planning like everyone else, except they call it the defense budget, which I think is a nice quip, since he was Clinton's Minister of Labour, wasn't he? And then, of course, the other side of it is this sort of, other type of communism, the abolition of the commodity, communal production, this sort of thing. And it was partly, slightly, obviously, from the title, slightly satirical, but it was about how the Americans, are superseding capitalism in cyberspace. And I think that was something we didn't put in there because, it was a short article. But yeah, we're certainly aware of it. And I had friends involved in that sort of in that interesting interface where they were like working on open source software and then using that software for their commercial jobs. And I thought that was a very interesting, this idea that, it's all a perfect market, which is lots of the California ideology was about. And then this other thing, which you said, Richard Saul, which is the other extreme, which is it can only exist as a completely decommodified experience, says he, being living in MIT, which is funded by the Department of Defense. It's that bit in the middle, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, and it's and I don't know how much attention you paid to the economics of open source, but I mean, even there, we've had this kind of emergent, I don't know, it's divergent system, because on the one hand, it's become extremely capitalized, with very large companies like IBM and other like Microsoft, making contributions to the Linux kernel, and funding developers there directly, and being Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, created a foundation, and it has all this gigantic corporate sponsorships. But then at the same time, it is, there's been controversies within that world about licensing, because in the case of Torvalds, the GNU project came out with multiple versions of their license, and he doesn't like their third license, and so there's been some controversy in that. Is that something you followed at all? I don't want to get into it if you haven't.
Oh, all those sort of Eric Raymond and all those people.
That was like Raymond was
the cathedral and the bazaar, but they were funny that he, in a way. Because it's strange how the way that image of the cathedral was then taken up by all these neo-reactionary types,
and the
Mouldings and all those sorts of people. Yeah, but it's obviously not a bazaar. It's not lots of small entrepreneurs in a market. And anyway, his idea of what a bazaar is very strange, because obviously the prices in a bazaar are more or less fixed. There's always a floor under which nobody will go. For obvious reasons, because they're all connected with each other by family and friendships. So that was also a stranger. He actually came to talk here, which I wasn't there, so it's nothing to do with me and the cyber communist article. But he somebody asked him this. They said, "Oh, isn't this all basically communism?" And he just stormed off the stage and refused to come back. He said, "Oh yeah, Europeans are all fucking everything." And stormed off, left much because we did, again, people, I wasn't there, but a lot of people there, because they're Europeans and involved in this, they're sort of anarchistic types, or they're probably, or maybe some of them have been in Trotskyist groups, so they're going to have this sort of left-wing sensibility and not see words like that as a bad thing. Whereas obviously if you come from America and you're a sort of right-wing gun nut, you're going to have this sort of atavistic reaction against this.
And that was actually a common criticism in the 90s.
It was open source. And obviously, I guess in America,
and that's actually why they
his right flank by In Europe, if you say, well, we're doing a communist software project, people say, oh, good, that sounds excellent. You're part of you're part of the left. Or if you're in certain countries in Europe, you probably get a grant for saying that. Whereas obviously in America, you might, you're not going to get that, are you?
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't. And, but I guess perhaps that's another conversation. But so take us then to your book, Imaginary Futures, which you wrote several decades later.
It was a sort of development. It came out of this. I mean, I wanted to write a book on Marshall McLuhan. I think that's the really basic idea behind it. It was two things. I wanted to do the prehistory of the internet, where it wasn't California, because it struck me that it was obviously not California. It was, and then as I explained, my father was on this MIT, working a sabbatical at MIT, basically, from his job in England, funded by the CIA. And his great hero was Walt Rostow, who was National Security Advisor for Lyndon Baines Johnson, and helped, organise a military coup in Brazil, which overthrew democracy, and was obviously most notoriously involved in the invasion of Vietnam. And my father, I remember he came to dinner after he murdered a few 100,000 people. And so there was that milieu. He knew people like Daniel Bell. So they're in the Democratic. I mean, again, very similar to now. They were in the Democratic Party, and in some ways, in internal politics, they seem left of centre. So I always remember Rostow going on about how he'd been forced into retirement and lost it, but he was involved in improving education, particularly for African Americans and Hispanics, and he's in favour of healthcare and all the rest of it. But this is the guy who was like a vicious fascist as soon as he went abroad, and you can see that with the Biden administration. It's the same thing, really. Internally, you could say that a lot of the stuff they're doing. Not so with railroad, but in some things you could argue they're doing quite progressive things. But externally, they're just the normal horrible imperialist Americans
protecting the empire,
and they're resulting in the deaths of large numbers of people. And then they're just going to walk away, having destroyed the country, and they'll just walk away and leave the mess for someone else to sort out, which is what they did in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. It's funny that where my mother lives in the coast, we just happened to get this taxi driver, and his family had worked for the occupation in Afghanistan and got evacuated, and he was just like doing this taxi job while he was going through college, and he just went on to this whole rant against the Americans. So they destroyed the country by the because they intervened in the 1970s against the Stalinist
Russian. Yeah.
So. Yeah, and not even before the Russians, because they sort of and he said that's what all went wrong, was Zbigniew Brzezinski sending the Mujahideen to wreck his country. And I've heard that from other Afghans, who are really bitter, because they say, well, if they just left well alone, we wouldn't have been a very democratic society, but it would have been more or less secular. Women could dress how they like, and this sort of thing. But now they've just absolutely destroyed the country. And it's going to take 40, 50 years to get back to where they were in the 1970s even.
But at the same time, though, I mean, in the 80s, there was, especially in France, there was a different idea for the network society. Tell our viewers about that for those who don't. I mean, I was a French student in the 90s, so they told us all about it. They were
so they had the first mass public packet switching network wasn't the internet. It was actually this system called Minitel. So in the 1970s, there was this report done called the Computerization of Society. There was this guy called Simon Nora, who was like a big bureaucrat, basically, from Italy, and this up and coming socialist politician called Alain Manc. He eventually becomes quite well known, and they write this report and they say, well, what France has to do is not get overwhelmed by American technology. And so what we need is a grand projet to stop this. And so what they suggested was what became Minitel. And Minitel was essentially, it was like a dumb terminal. I mean, it's what we now call cloud computing, I guess. So France Telecom would have these big servers, and you would, instead of having a telephone directory, a paper telephone, you would get a free terminal. And then on this terminal, which basically used premium phone lines, you could access various services on it. So a lot of them were information services. I don't know, say if you're a farmer, you can find out about the price of potatoes or things like that. In 1985, we booked a train ticket online. This seemed like the future. I thought, God, this is amazing. Actually, we couldn't actually buy it. We actually had to turn up at the station, but I could. It shows you how far America is behind. We bought a high-speed train ticket down to the south coast. So that was quite amazing. But then the big thing that really took off and made money for it was what were called messageries, which were essentially chat lines, where you could go on. And a lot of things that became famous on the internet about people, changing their sex or age or whatever, became really famous through that. So a lot of them were being French about sex, of course, or human. If you went to Paris in the 1980s, they were all full of, it was all full of these sort of little stickers everywhere advertising erotic massagery services. But obviously, people on the left use them for political organising. People just use them for social life. I remember somebody who worked for France Telecom. She did this really interesting report on it. And she tells this very sweet story about this teenage boy who makes friends with this middle-aged, grandmother, basically, actually, woman. And then normally they would never meet and become friends, but because they were, I can't even remember what they had some common interest, and through this connection, through online connection, they then became friends in real life. So this guy who probably would only know, apart from his parents' friend, not know anybody of that generation, suddenly has a very good friend from that generation. And she suddenly knows a teenage boy who she doesn't normally have friends with. And she said that's really interesting because it broke down that social barrier. And they were talking about that in the 1980s, not in the 1990s. So lots of the stuff that, Howard Rheingold would later talk, laud in the virtual community, was already happening in France in the 1980s. The problem was, there were two problems with it. I mean, first, it was only in France, and it didn't have that, the Californian ideology was this idea that the internet was the whole world, basically. So you didn't have that wonderful ability to think globally. Suddenly I have friends who moved abroad, and thanks to the internet, I'm still friends with them. Or friends who moved abroad and I lost contact with suddenly came back into my life because we are connected through this technology. And the other thing is it was on premium phone lines. So it made sense to run these services. I mean, I knew someone who ran a radio station. They basically funded it through the massagery services. Because France Telecom would take 50% and you'd get 50%. So you could make quite, I assume some of the sex lines, probably they did make lots of money, but you could certainly make enough. And of course, when the internet came along, it offered these services for free or with advertising. And so it was both the technology had problems because it was only French, and it was also based on this, dumb terminal, big mainframe. And there was that moment of the PC.
It was text only, yeah.
And it was text. That's what I'm saying. And the PC came along, and that's the other interesting thing is that there was that moment when the intelligence went from the center into the piece, into the periphery. I mean, now it's starting to go back again.
Yeah. Well, that's
as you said, you could do, suddenly with the internet, you could do see you, see me, and talk to people on videos across, not rather flakily, and it would break up. But this was amazing. There's another thing you couldn't do or show pictures or have color, for instance. Mm-hmm. But so it got technologically superseded as well, because I think also ideologically it lost out because this idea of a state-led project, which in 1981, particularly when Francois Mitterrand was elected as the socialist president, seemed absolutely the future. By early 1990s, that just seemed like the past because the French Socialist Party had embraced neoliberalism by then.
Yeah, well,
social liberalism, they called it.
Yeah, well, the funny thing though about Minitel though is that people continued to use it right up until the very end. I mean, there were.
Of course, because
by the time they ended it, there were like almost 1 million terminals still in use in 2012.
Because it was really easy to use. And I think also, it's like any of these technologies, once people have learned to use them, they're reluctant to learn a new thing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Why would you do something else when if I don't know, if you're used to getting certain types of information or total services out of it
in that manner,
and you don't want to buy a computer and go through all the hassle with computers that don't work or connections and all the rest.
And you couldn't get a virus. Yeah,
you couldn't get a virus. It's just really simple. It was just like but it's like how people have. They don't have smartphones. That would seem. A lot of people, some people I know have actually gone back to dumb phones, as they call them, because they don't want all the distraction of social media or whatever. They just want to make phone calls and send texts. So that's all they want. And that's, I think, the same with Minitel. There was a certain element in French society. We're fine. Why do we need? Why do we need to set up a PC, particularly when it was a PC and there's all that hassle with PCs, and particularly if they're running Windows, where it's still a bit flaky. It's not plug and play, And you have to sit there and work out from Microsoft why they couldn't get the drive. Why doesn't Microsoft have all the drivers automatically installed? All that sort of nonsense,
But I guess the other thing that's interesting also, and obviously Minitel hadn't shut down at that point that you wrote Californian Ideology, but from a information economy, news, media, journalistic economy, Minitel was also more sustainable than what later developed.
It actually paid people for making content and hosting services. So it wasn't reliant on advertising and free labor. I think that's a really interesting part of it. And so you have this sort of the capital, the socialist state, as people denounced, doing this project. But actually, in a way, it was more on, it was actually, actually create a market in a way that when we talk about open source, the problem of how do you make money online? I mean, the sort of push towards social media has obviously been a part of that, is because how do you get the advertising revenue? Because it becomes dependent on advertising revenue. And then that advertising revenue hoovers up, is captured by the platforms, not by the content producers.
And captured by the advertising operator themselves.
Exactly. So and there's all the surveillance problems with it involved with it as well. I mean, as soon as Artie's mother got pregnant, I immediately got bombarded with nappy adverts. So I thought that's great. I don't think I'd announced it to anybody, certainly not publicly online, but it had picked up that I was about to become a father. But it's just so you're really aware then of the level of surveillance. I mean, what's interesting about that I think also is that the French bought in, because we talk about the Californian idea, they bought into this idea that there was one global information society, which would be run by California, and they sort of resist it. You now get this talk in the European Union of digital sovereignty, and you think, well, unless you, I've been at conferences where I just say to them, well, what have you been doing since the 1990s? You've allowed eBay, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, all these companies to take over this space, and they're run from California or Oregon or wherever, and they're not European. And it's, put it bluntly, America is a hostile power in many ways to Europe. But you're just so enamored by the empire, you can't see it. And it's interesting because people criticize the Chinese for creating this great firewall of China, as it's called, and obviously it does have censorship things behind it, but you think actually that it was probably the CPC, Communist Party of China's greatest decision, actually, because it's economically protected its computing and internet industries, which has allowed them to develop. So they have their own equivalents of e-commerce sites, which are actually now more successful.
And are now on the international.
And they have their own, exactly. They have all their own equivalents to these platforms, but they're actually Chinese. And of course, now they're exporting them with things like, they now got a software industry, and so they can create TikTok. So the growing social platform outside China is actually a Chinese piece of software. And then Zoom is the other obvious example, which though it's got a nice shell company operating it in California, it's actually all the software is written in China. So that's the other interesting. So I used to, a long time ago, I would say, this is a good example of the Leninist state, making sure it's protecting its information monopoly. But actually, I've just completely gone through 180 degrees. I just think that was the best thing they ever did, is build the great firewall of China, just from an economic point of view. And that's what Europe didn't do. So the Minitel logic would be you generalize Minitel across the whole of the European Union and build a big firewall stopping American corporations operating in that space, because otherwise you don't have sovereignty.
Yeah, well, or pipe it in some, external method or something like that.
Well, the Chinese have pushed out Google and Amazon.
Oh, yeah. But no, I'm saying like
through a combination of political and economic, they don't exist, or you can only access. I mean, I've talked to people who've lived there, and they said, well, what's interesting, it's easy to jump over the firewall with a VPN, but most people just don't bother, because why would you bother to go? And then occasionally they'll just fuck up the VPNs just to make sure they don't become too popular. But they have, like everybody who wants to get over the firewall can, if they really want to. But they just make it a hassle. And if you've got your mobile phone, you're probably not going to install a VPN, because all the services you really want, the equivalent, ride, hailing a taxi or buying food online or whatever, are all going to be in these Chinese services. Or your social media, that's where all your friends are on Chinese sites, not on Twitter.
Well, and that's a network effect.
And they made that happen in a way that the European failed to do it. And I think partly it's because of that end of empire Californian ideology moment, where Europe lost confidence in itself. And as I said, you can see this at the moment, where Europe is sacrificing its own economic self-interest over this horrible conflict in Eastern Europe, and it's not making any effort to stop it, because it won't do anything without the permission of the Biden regime. And that's really interesting that sort of, something that fundamental, where you could deindustrialize the German economy, put millions of people on the dole. They can't do it because they're so captured, this generation, by the post-1991 end of history Californian ideology. They can't imagine a world without America as the hegemon.
Well, and I mean, now part of that might be also that they de-invested in their own military industrial complexes as well. I mean, Well, that's the paradox, though, isn't it?
Well, no. I mean, I know what I mean. I mean, that's the other. I mean, obviously, yes, exactly. It's much cheaper to let the Americans defend you, in inverted commas. But the trouble is, then they drag you. They can drag you into a conflict which is being lost. So that's the real danger. It's actually now they've blundered into this conflict, and the Europeans can't control something happening on their own border, because they have no sovereignty. And it's not just I said that's a really obvious crisis at the moment, but it's a generalized thing across Europe about how it's part of the West, whatever that means. And then we've got this, if there's a multipolar world emerging, which there obviously is, you're suddenly said, the international community, actually 85% of humanity is not part of the international community, or the rules-based international order, or whatever phrase there is. And they're actually looking, their major trading partner is China, for instance, or so that becomes a really interesting moment about what happens when I was told. Sorry, just to finish it. I mean, I was actually told by somebody who's allegedly left of centre that the problem with this is that China is an alien civilization. And I just looked at them with amazement, thinking, they think they're green and have tentacles or something. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing to say, and they said it without thinking. They said, sort of like, why is China an alien civilization? I mean, because it doesn't have that sort of, Europe and then its offshoot America history. But, most of the world, doesn't necessarily share that. India was colonized by Britain, but, the fact that the Chinese have their own 2,000 years of history and their own legends and all the rest of it, I mean, it doesn't make them alien. It's one of the interesting things about. We talk to
it
Chinese.
Just means you don't know about it,
or appreciate it, or you don't appreciate it, or you've been so brainwashed to think that everything since 1945 has been nine in China has been a horror show, and this sort of thing. It's just I find that very, very strange. The whole idea that dismiss a fifth of humanity as aliens.
Well, but let's stay on that point a little bit more, though, because we've talked before the show that You know, if somebody were to write an essay about where the future is being located at or being built now, you were saying that it would be in Shenzhen.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, not that I have never studied. I don't speak
or
Chinese.
at least as an arguable.
But I said, I mean, I said it would probably be called the Shenzhen ideology, wouldn't it?
Because, yeah. So okay. So but for those who don't know it, like, tell us about Shenzhen. What is that?
Okay. So Shenzhen is this place next to Hong Kong. It was a fishing village. It's now surpassed Hong Kong as an economic zone. It's on this Pearl River Delta where there's a whole series of cities with Hong Kong and Macau at the front, the ex-colonies, and it's really where all the high-tech industry is. You know, where Huawei and all these other Tencent. That's where they're all based, basically. I mean, obviously, there's other places in China, you know, Beijing, Shanghai, and so on. They're also innovating, but it's the key place where it's got this entrepreneurial culture. And they say they innovate at Shenzhen time. You know, so they're. You know, like you would have said in the 1990s, if you want to be at the cutting edge of technology, you go to Silicon Valley. Now people would say go to Shenzhen. You can go to these like big markets and buy anything, any piece of technology. You can get the prototype into production, and so and it's also the other reason is I said it's that weird mixture of this, you know, the both this very cutthroat capitalist competition and the sort of Chinese Maoist vision of the future. So the reason why I said this, I saw this program where they went to some startup in Shenzhen, and they had the characters of a line from Mao Zedong's On Protracted War on the wall, and I assume because his calligraphy is very famous that it's in his handwriting as well. And so it's a similar thing that when I remember being taken to the Facebook's offices in Stamford, and it had a clenched fist salute behind the receptionist desk, and that's the same thing. And they've got, but their history is not, you know, the Wild West, the American War of Independence, liberalism. Their history is different. The way they modernized was through the Communist Party of China winning the revolution in 1949 and going through all the stages that they needed to get to where they are now. And so that I thought was an interesting way. It's that the combination of left and right, which you know, Deng Xiaoping made possible to take off. But again, but of course, the interesting is Chinese people say, well, actually, it was also like that in the 1950s to a certain extent. So there's that combination of both, you know, capitalist modernization and socialist modernization together as one moment has that same feel as the Californian ideology. That's what I was.
Well, and I guess one of the other kind of interesting notes, the parallels though, is that Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, also loves China and talks about how they are the model for the future.
Yeah, but he doesn't get the whole Mao thing. I mean, that's the interesting. He doesn't really understand that part of it. He sees as somehow illegitimate. You know, they'll only be happy when China does what the Soviet Union did in 1991. Yeah, he wants to pull down all the statues of Mao and bury him and all the rest of it. Whereas actually, you know, it's interesting. I have people who obviously not being leftists are obviously very critical of the government, but they don't see that as an illegitimate part of their history. They see that as an essential part of their history. I mean, I had this one friend of mine who was teaching in Hong Kong, and I remember when his daughter was doing history, China, and he said, "We're on the Long March this week. It's really exciting." And it's like, you know, I don't know, it's a bit like Valley Forges for Americans, you know. It's a foundation myth of the modern state. And so this idea that, you know, because with the West, we're taught that everything about, you know, before Deng Xiaoping is evil. It just doesn't make sense to Chinese people. They just think this is bonkers. You know, the average age of Chinese people in 1949 was 35. The average lifespan was 35 years. And then when Mao died, it was 64 years. So whatever else happened, you can, you know, obviously the things that happened, there were lots of horrible things that happened during his reign, but to the mass of the population, it was a huge improvement compared to the previous 2,000 years. So that's the difficulty, that again, the way that his quotations and poetry and writings are essential part of modern Chinese culture. And so if you're going to set up your startup, you're going to think that you are like the Communist Party of China in the 1930s. It was the Communist Party of China was the most successful startup in Chinese history, wasn't it? They started off with like 10 or 11 members and ended up ruling the whole country.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of interesting also, though, that this Chinese ideology or Shenzhen ideology, there's a lot of similarities, I think, in some ways of beyond just blending left and right, but also it's you could argue that it might be an iteration of the California ideology, because instead of the trappings of democracy, it's not even bothering with those. It's just saying, well, we're going to step past that point here.
Well, it comes, but you have to understand that the materialist conception of history, which is in a way how we all think about the world, whether or not we are, is that sees history in stages, and people obviously criticize it and say, no, we can do something else, or we could leap forward into a new utopia, but it's so ingrained in modernity. So Adam Smith says, we start off with hunting, and then we go to herding, and then agriculture, and then commerce, and then what leftists did in the 19th century is add communism as the next stage. That's all they did. Say, well, actually, we don't. The end of history isn't commerce, liberalism. There's another stage afterwards, and in a way, that's what we're all bound in, that view of history. I mean, you can go through and criticize and say, oh, some people went from herding back to hunting, or agriculture back to hunting. So there's ebbs and flows, but you can say there's this concept of progress does argue in favour of that happening. In most recent history, most of the people a few hundred years ago lived off subsistence agriculture with all the problems of disease and famine, and now I think half the world, or just over half the world now, is living in cities. And China, that's very obvious, isn't it? I mean, they lived in immense poverty of again, subsistence agriculture, and now whatever it is, 60% of the population now live in cities, and their living standards have shot up. So that seems as progress, and therefore they start to believe that they are going forward, and they do see the world as still in stages. That they were in feudalism, and now we're going along the capitalist road, and eventually they will get to the communist future, which whatever that means. I'm never sure what they mean by that, but that's officially what they think they're doing. Yeah. They're following the capitalist road to communism. And although other people argue they've been doing that since 1949, but that gives that, in that sense, you can see the parallel, because the California ideology, and before that, the people who are writing the information society, the technotronic age, or whatever, were also responding to the Stalinist version of that. And that, so in a way that's a common view of history. I mean, I got this Chinese communist. He said he has this wonderful line. He said, "We used to go to America to see the future, and now we go there to see the past." Mm-hmm. Well, and feel self-confident, with high-speed rails and ways and all the rest of it, that they are now the future. 5G, you can't get decent 5G reception, or you can't buy everything with a card or with your phone. Also, I don't know. There's that vision that somehow they're catching up and surpassing America in technology and in social organisation. 4 million didn't die of COVID. We should be the equivalent of the COVID deaths in America. Those sort of visions make them feel confident that they, whether rightly or wrongly, that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess the other thing also that's different from the sort of neoliberal ideology is that the Chinese also did not willfully throw away manufacturing. That they were using it. On the contrary, like they're built. That's the bedrock of what they're doing.
It's the workshop of the world.
In that sense, in that sense, the neoliberal, techno libertarianism it kind of, it was a rejection of the labor theory of value, of actual products and things that were built, and financialization in favor of financialization,
and the rejection of the working class. I mean, they, in a way, what they wanted, they were afraid of the industrial working class in the West, weren't they? So they thought, wow, if you send it out to China and India and Mexico, they can deal with all that. They can deal with all the troublesome labour relationships and trade unions. And particularly if it's an authoritarian state, that's much better, because then they'll keep wages low. And then we'll just do the sunrise industry. That's the sun. They were called. They always had. I was saying this earlier on in the 1980s. The Thatcher neoliberals were all talking about. We should abandon the sunset industries, manufacturing basically, and replace it with the sunrise industries, which were like new technologies, but also finance, of course.
And of course, finance has ultimately done nothing for the world economy.
Yeah, but they could hoover up the profits out of these. So someone like a manufacturer in China, like 80 cents out of every dollar was actually going to the West. Their take out of that $1 of value realized was actually very low. And what's happened is that they've slowly gone up the technological sophistication, where now they are making the new technologies. They are the people creating,
and they're the consumers of it as well.
And then in a good Keynesian sense, the producers are the consumers. They're talking about so if you want to create in the circuit of capital, and in the introductory chapters of volume 2 of Capital, that's what it is. They've got that. You can realize the value. You can create effective demand, and that's one of the reasons why living standards have to rise in China. And they're not too. It's interesting about recently in Foxconn, they had this huge, basically a riot, to force Foxconn to fulfill this labour contracts. They'd signed up all these new labour workers. And it was interesting how, I was thinking in the West, the police would have been really violent in suppressing the protests, but how passive the Chinese police were. So they obviously were, though they don't like organised trade unions, they're quite willing to tolerate mass protest, because it's probably in their long-term interest to push wages up.
Yeah, well, I mean, although they're dealing with some other things as well, like
I mean, but you could be
zero COVID massive policies.
Well, which yes, they well,
yeah.
I don't think Americans should lecture the Chinese on COVID policy, should they? Really?
Oh yeah, well, no, it's like two opposite sides of the coin.
This friend of mine in Bangkok said they call it the COVID the white man's virus, because Westerners lack the social self-discipline to keep it under control, which I thought was a bit cruel.
That's an interesting insult there. But all right, well, so it's been a good conversation here. But let's maybe for the final discussion topic here, let's maybe bring it back to this whole thing that we've been talking about today, and your written work here is about a vision of the future, a vision of progress, lodestar, if you will, that the necessity of humans wanting something to be pointing toward. So there has been an emergence with Bernie Sanders, and until he was like you could argue Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and there's some pieces in other countries around the world as well. But so there was an emergence of a
Jean-Luc
further left.
France Insoumise. All over Europe, there are these movements, which are trying to re-engage the left.
But here's the thing, though, is that so a lot of that critique. A lot of these movements tend to be mostly around critique and not enough about substance, and toward a new vision of the future, an iteration of leftism, if you will, that people can point toward as something that, we don't like this neoliberal present. Well, what could we have instead?
Well, I think the greatest achievement of Jeremy Corbyn during his leadership was the 2 election manifestos. So, we came within 100,000 votes of winning in 2017. Unfortunately, in 2019, it turned into a bit of a disaster. and the Blairites came back into control of the Labour Party. But those two manifestos, I think, did give, a sort of left social democratic alternative. I think that's why they were so determined to get rid of it. I think also, as we can see in the present international crisis, they wouldn't have liked a prime minister of Great Britain who was running around trying to create peace in Europe. This would have been most unfortunate for the empire. But I think there is in there a sort of trying to take a lot of the ideas of social democratic new left experiments and update them for the 21st century. I mean, we wrote this digital democracy manifesto with Jeremy's second leadership campaign. And some of it went into the manifesto, from Digital Bill of Rights, and basically trying to make more sort of trying to make platform co-ops, these sorts of things. I mean, there's various ideas that were going around about trying to create a sort of it's not overthrowing capitalism or creating cybernetic communism, but at least it's pushing society in that direction. And I think that was the worry. There was the thing that Thatcher said, there is no alternative. And she deliberately closed down anything that looked like an alternative. And in a way, you can see that's why in the West, the ideal is America, its political system, where you have two political parties which are both controlled by the rich. So you have blue and red, and they're essentially the same party. They have cultural war differences, but on the economy, they're no different. And on imperial policy, they're no different, as far as I can see. And they might criticize each other when they're out of power, but they'll just do the same thing when they're in power. And that, in a way, has been the problem in a so-called democracy in the West, I think, for decades. And so these emergence of the alternatives, whether it's the DSA in America, the whole Corbyn project here, France Insoumise, Linke in Germany, and so on, it's that they're trying to actually create something that says something different and says there's a different way. But the warning is, when a radical party was elected in Greece, Syriza, it got crushed basically very quickly. And not just from externally, but internally, it was very difficult for even people elected to power to actually break with the existing system because they're so tied in with it. And so, I don't know, if we got elected in 2017, how long we would have stayed in power, I don't know. I mean, because a large part of the Labour Party would have preferred the Tories to win. They want, they were at the, it's a bit like you've got people like Manchin, haven't you, in Congress, who are essentially Republicans in all but name. But
yeah, well, in the U.S., it's a contest between reactionaries and conservatives.
Exactly, and the Democrats are the conservatives, basically. But the sad thing, I think, is the way that the DSA has got completely co-opted into the Biden regime. They've not opposed the war, and they've gone along with breaking a railroad strike, which I think is really shocking, to be honest. Their function is okay. I have no objection. I can see because of the political system, the electoral system, in particular, you have to work within the Democratic Party, but to actually go along with to not oppose the defence budget every year, you should vote against the defence budget on principle, not a penny, not a man, as they used to say before 1914. You never vote for the military because nothing else. They'll be used against you if you're not careful. So that seems to be a real thing. And then also the real basic thing is you stand in solidarity with strikes, never cross a picket line. And so that's the worry. Once people get into power, they start to be recuperated. They start to become like the people they claimed to oppose when they were elected. And that's been a problem for the left, since the early 20th century. The 19th century, we could keep our principles firm because we were excluded from power. But the 20th century is a story of what happens when socialists and communists come to power, and you can say there's been immense achievements made across the world, but also they have become the system in many ways, and people eventually end up rebelling against the left. You get these sort of strays in Eastern Europe. Well, I remember Jacek Kuren, who was one of the theorists of Solidarność, and he said, my basic aim in life in Poland is to make the left and the right. But even now in 2022, it's very difficult to see that. I mean, some of the people who are often arguing most for welfare and state intervention are actually considered to be on the right, and often the far right, actually. And people who are supposed to be on the left turn out to be basically soft neoliberals. So this is the difficulty. This is not that we haven't rearranged it so there's class politics. No, that's why they're so into lifestyle issues, or even you could argue a lot of the green issues, because they're not tackling the cause of the environmental crisis. They're just doing sort of superficial measures to and I think that's the problem.
Certainly that's what carbon credits are, and taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Which can then, or carbon credits, even worse, that can be traded. So wow, we just made more money for Wall Street and the City of London. Tackling these key issues. I mean, it comes back to what we were trying to say in the California. You have to have a class. It's a class issue at the end of the day. It's not meaning these other issues aren't important, but unless you're talking about the class issue, the divide between the mass of the population who have to sell their labour for a living, and the very small group of people who own all the wealth, you're not really talking serious politics, actually.
It's also, though, that understanding that these things are linked together, because that you cannot have progress again. That racism or
especially in America, because since Nathaniel.
But I mean not just race, but sexism or
I know, I understand. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm just saying that.
I'm saying, but they're all linked together. Like they're used as tools of people to preserve their wealth. And you certainly see that with like Elon Musk with trying to attack transgender people as if that has anything to do with him and his billions of dollars.
Vice versa,
has nothing to do with it.
Or vice versa, the Biden regime thinking somehow the US military is progressive if it has a transgender official on the top of it, or a woman running Raytheon or whatever, somehow these corporations.
That's something to celebrate or something.
Or a black man who's running the Ministry of Defense. I mean, this is nothing to celebrate. I mean, they're no, the fact that they have a diversity in the ruling elite doesn't mean they're not the ruling elite anymore. It's just they just got a better faith.
And it doesn't help the people that are from these groups.
Barack Obama being the great example is, they had 8 years of a black president, and African Americans were worse off. They were both relatively and in absolute terms worse off compared to the rest of America. And he was supposed to be the black president. In the 1970s, if you said we're going to have a black president, they would think like this was radical. It was like Hugh P. Newton in power or something. I don't know. But no. It turned out that he was just a front
another neoliberal,
Street, basically, in the military-industrial complex. That's what he was. He's done very well out of it. He has a big house in Martha's Vineyard and all the rest of it. Him and his family have done well. But for the average worker who happens to be African American, he offered nothing. He offered a sort of moral boost, didn't he? Okay, there's someone like me as president, but he's not really like them. He's actually not like them. He's a member of the elite. He's a member of the capitalist class. And so if you're a worker, you have nothing in common with him. He's got much more in common with Dick Cheney than he has with your average inhabitant of Oakland or South Central LA.
Yeah. Well, so ultimately trying to get people to understand the sort of sense of shared fate and shared struggle, that's ultimately what has to be done.
Well, I think you have to think that we've spent, the Cold War, and now what we've been talking about, what happened in the last 30 years, one of the key things has been to stop that. There's been a very deliberate policy to divide and rule the workers, basically, and to create alternative visions of the future.
Well, all right. So I want to actually end on a more positive note, though, here. So, so I guess, tell us what a better vision of the future is. Just like a few points here that you would say.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two ways you have to think about the future. I mean, the first is, the set of practical reasons the left have to put forward, which I said that, these election manifestos are not the Labour Party produced, which are a great collective effort. Lots of people put their ideas were a way of creating a 21st century vision of a working social democracy. Maybe that's actually utopian now. The empire will never allow what it actually was willing to tolerate in previous decades. So there's that, which is, let's improve things at a really basic level, local level, make sure people have access to healthcare and education and housing and transport and all the benefits of these new technologies, to make sure that they're properly distributed among the whole population. Because we all love these technologies. Here I am having an interview with you on video for free. This is extraordinary, isn't it, really? I mean, it's an amazing...
Well, I'm paying for it, but yeah.
Maybe you're paying for it. We could do it on Zoom for long, whatever, yeah. Well, very cheap. Let's say very
Point
cheap.
taken, though. Point taken.
Point taken. I mean, so there's this huge pot of potential in this technology, which is not being realised, basically, because the system doesn't want to realise it. They want to channel it in ways that profit them. There's a great argument this guy put out he said you can only understand the history of the last 100 or so years as the prevention of communism. That's what all the elites around the world are trying to prevent capitalism spontaneously evolving into communism, which is a nice sort of Hegelian conceit, I thought. So that's the other side of it. You need to have some utopian vision of a post-capitalist society where people are empowered, to create the truly human civilization, where, it's not money and wealth and war that dominate our lives, but they're having, looking after our children and our old people and actually living a civilized life, and not living to work, but just to work to and all that sort of thing. To create jobs that are meaningful, to create communities where people are connected with each other, to try and solve these problems of alienation and loneliness. So that's the other side of it. So that's that. If you think about the advantages our ancestors had in the 19th century before they actually had to go through the experience of left-wing government, is that they had this vision. They could actually have these visions of what communism were. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels carefully didn't define what they meant by it because they were being more practical about it. But lots of other people said, America was full of these utopian experiments, wasn't it? All over the place for a long period of time. So that, and that's, the bit of the new left that we also should recover, I think, is those ideas of how can we live in different ways? How can we interact with each other? And maybe not quite as stoned as they were, but they might be a bit more practical. But that's also what we need to do, is to take those technologies and see whether we can connect together in a better way. Because, there are other visions of the future. You say, that we can see them, these very authoritarian, top-down corporate visions. I'm not sure whether we can rely on the Communist Party of China to create full communism either.
Yeah, that seems unlikely. All right. Well, this has been a good conversation here. Appreciate your time here. So we've been speaking with Richard Barbrook. He is the author of Imaginary Futures, which I will put up on the screen. It's a book that came out in 2007, worth checking out. And then if you are on Twitter as well, you can follow him at Richard Barbrook. That's Barbrook. So thanks for being here today.
I'm also involved with a project called Class War Games, which
yes, and let me put that one up.
We didn't really touch on, which is a whole different angle on looking at the world as through these. Well, again, comes out that my interest in the American military-industrial complex, who played games to decide how the future would be there, and Guy Debord, who was one of the founders of Situationism, who invented a war game.
Yeah, well, I'll put a link in the show notes to those as well, so people can check those out. Well, anyway, so Richard Barbrook, great having you here today, and I encourage everybody to check out your work. Thank you. All right, so that's our program for today. Appreciate everybody joining us, and just a reminder that we are part of the Flux.community network. And please do check us out at flux.community. And then you can also go to theoryofchange.show to go to the archives of the show there. And we have transcripts and audio and video of all the episodes. But if you want to get the full transcripts of every episode, you get usually about half of each episode in text. But if you want to get the full transcripts, just go to patreon.com/discoverflux. And we definitely are thankful and grateful to the people who do support us on there as well. So I really appreciate that.